Thank you all for joining us this evening as we honor the birth centenary of one of India's most influential modernists. Tyeb Mehta was a pioneer whose vision and discipline has paved the way for a generation of contemporary artists. He was a meticulous and uncompromising artist who spent a lifetime redefining the language of Indian art. His powerful, unforgettable images of trussed bulls, goddesses, and iconic falling figures are fraught with violence and filled with intensity and anguish. But more importantly, they reveal his profound sensitivity and great capacity for empathy and vulnerability, which is what has made him a true master of his craft. These figures articulate the inner turmoil that he carried with him throughout his life, especially following his experiences surrounding the partition of India. Yet, within their contorted forms, they carry a quiet nudge to rise above the circumstances that bind us. Tonight, we celebrate Tyeb's life and legacy with the launch of a special limited edition portfolio of prints handpicked by his wife, Tyeb Mehta. They're up on the wall there, as you can see them. This will be followed by a talk by Ranjit Hoskote, following which the Tyeb Mehta Foundation will announce scholarships for the students of the JJ School of Art, Tyeb's alma mater. This evening is part of a year-long celebration and collaboration between the Tyeb Mehta Foundation and the Saffronart Foundation. We are extremely grateful to the family, Yusuf, Fatima, Himani, Wasim, and the children, for their ongoing support, and would also like to thank Mrs. Menon and the Jahangir Art Gallery for giving us this lovely venue and a very old, nostalgic venue to celebrate this birthday. It is my privilege now to invite Tyeb's wife and longtime companion and champion, Tyeb Mehta, to say a few words, followed by opening remarks by Tyeb Mehta's daughter and the trustee of the Tyeb Mehta Foundation, Himani Mehta Delve.
Welcome. I'm very happy today celebrating Tyeb's 100th birth anniversary. He has also painted called Celebration. I'm also very pleased to announce that Tyeb Mehta Foundation is starting a scholarship award for the students of JJ School of Art, where Tyeb had studied. He had very fond memories of his time at JJ. It is also a great pleasure for me to release a portfolio of his works for the first time. It was very difficult for me to select the 13 paintings, as according to me, every single one that he painted was a masterpiece. I decided to choose from different periods throughout his career. I will now call my beautiful daughter Himani to say a few words. Thank you.
Well, that was quite a compliment coming from my mother. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, all of you, for being here. I'm so overwhelmed to see such a full house. And I just want to say a little bit about, I'm actually feeling really overwhelmed. Today is actually a day of remembrance, of celebration, and of continuity. We gather here to mark what would have been my father's 100th birthday, a milestone that invites us not only to look back, but also carry forward the legacy. It's especially meaningful that this conversation is taking place here at Jahangir Art Gallery, the very space that hosted his first solo exhibition in 1959. That exhibition was not just the start of his public life in art. It was the beginning of a dialogue that he continued through his life with his work and with all of you. To just see his work up here on these walls today is to feel this conversation coming a full circle. My father believed in the power of conversation, exchange, and artistic fellowship. He found inspiration in dialogue with fellow artists, writers, friends, and creatives in other fields. He believed art was not something created in isolation. It grew out of exchange, curiosity, and a generosity of spirit. That's why he gave so much of his time to younger artists, offering encouragement, critique, and quiet support. That spirit of openness lives on, and we are honored to announce a scholarship program in his name for the students of the JJ School of Art, aimed at supporting the next generation of artists. And I see lots of students here, and really makes me happy to see them standing and waiting for their scholarship. This memorial lecture is held every year on this day, during the monsoon. We all know it's been raining like mad. I almost thought people won't make it. It's a tradition that reflects his lifelong connection to this city, to this gallery, and to its community of artists. So many visits, so many conversations, many of them right here. I half expect my father to walk in now, in his trademark white khadi kurta pajama, smiling, asking for tea and vada pav. We're thankful to Jahangir Art Gallery and to Mrs. Menon, who is here with us today, for offering us this space to host the centenary edition of Conversations with Chai, a program that truly embodies his spirit. This year also marks the beginning of a wider celebration of his life and work. We are fortunate to be collaborating with the Saffronart on a long-year centenary program, including a retrospective, publications, and a series of events that we hope will reflect not just his legacy, but his continuing relevance. My warmest thanks to Dinesh, Minal, Punya, and the entire Saffronart team for their dedication, thoughtfulness, and care in shaping this journey with us. And now it is my pleasure to invite Minal Wazirani, co-founder of Saffronart and Art Mumbai, and trustee of the Saffronart Foundation, to share a few words. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Himani. Good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be standing in front of you today as we celebrate 100 years of an artist who has given us so much through his art, other than art, his philosophy, his perspective, his sense of creative innovation, of course, and also, most importantly, forging a path for those who follow. And it is one of the reasons for the scholarship that Himani spoke about. And as she mentioned, it's even more special that we're standing in the same place. He had his first solo exhibition, and now we have these prints up on the wall. I want to share a quick comment with you. Atul Dodia, who's here, and was someone who spent a great deal of time with Tyeb in his studio, mentioned that he was so happy to see these works up because from, I think, the fourth work onwards, he's seen every single one in Tyeb's studio. So it's a bit of a homecoming, I think, for all of us and for these works. As we get into this year, it's very important for us at Saffronart also. It's a collaboration between the Tyeb Mehta Foundation and the Saffronart Foundation in Tyeb's 100th year and Saffronart's 25th year. So I'd like to take a quick moment to tell you a little bit about the foundation that Dinesh and I founded. And this really came together for us to be able to harness the incredible power that art brings, not only as a tool for expression, but also as a platform for education, to drive social change, to build community, to explore identity. And frankly, I don't think I can think of a more fitting artist than Tyeb to be somewhat of a guiding light on this journey for us. Since its establishment, the foundation is engaged with several art-driven social initiatives, including funding for meal programs, art projects at educational centers in underserved areas of Mumbai, educational outreach in marginalized communities, and benefit auctions for disaster and medical relief. The beneficiaries of the foundation's support have included several organizations out there, including the National Museum for Women in the Arts, Apnale, Start India, the Aravani Art Project, the Kochi Biennale, as you all know, and specific projects at the Venice Biennale, among several others. In addition to these, however, the Saffronart Foundation has also worked on preserving and highlighting contributions from some of India's most iconic artists, and that's really what we're here to do today. During the inaugural edition of Art Mumbai, we displayed the Fantasy Collection by M.F. Hussain, and last year we showed works of F.N. Souza and V.S. Gaitonde in an exhibition. And I think, it was titled 100 Years of Fortitude. So in a sense, we're celebrating the centenary of two of Tyeb's contemporaries as well. But most importantly, this year, we are bringing a fabulous collection of works by Tyeb, which are not always accessible to a wider audience. And in doing so, we hope to offer a much deeper understanding of the life and practices of an artist who, for all his well-deserved acclaim, still, I think, remains remarkably private. And just to take us on the journey to have the discussion about Tyeb and open up a little more is going to be Yusuf, who gets us started. So it gives me great pleasure to now invite Tyeb Mehta's son and the trustee of the Tyeb Mehta Foundation, Yusuf Mehta.
Thank you, Meenal. Good evening, everyone. A centenary year is a remarkable event. It only comes once in a century, so it was a moment to reflect, forced us to look back at our life with my father, and especially go back to the young days. It was not always easy living with someone like that, especially when you're a young boy. You don't always understand what is happening, and sometimes things were baffling. So one day I asked him, Daddy, because I used to see people, there were no religious figures, no idols, no nothing. We didn't pray, we didn't do anything. So I said, Daddy, see, my friends are Hindu or Muslim or Sikhs or Christians, and what are we? What religion do we belong to? And he thought for a little while, not very long, and he says, I believe in humanity. I'm a humanist. And I think it is that belief that shaped and was at the core of his vision and his artistic practice that he brought, that deep empathy and understanding and concern for what it is to be human. His canvases, powerful and deeply evocative, speak not only of artistic mastery, but of the essence of the human condition: struggle, transformation, and resilience. These are themes that echo across continents and generations, and today, as we gather here, we do more than celebrate his extraordinary legacy. We reaffirm our responsibility to let his pioneering spirit inspire and uplift us, the artists of today and tomorrow. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for the Tyeb Mehta Foundation. And on behalf of the family and the foundation, we renew our commitment to create vibrant spaces where artists, critics, curators, and scholars come together to collaborate, to question, and to spark new ideas. These conversations are more than dialogue, they are catalysts for fresh creative directions and deeper understanding. Supporting critical writing, scholarship, and the publication of new research is equally vital. Art does not exist in isolation. It lives and breathes within the rich context of our cultural, social, and political lives. It is through rigorous discourse and thoughtful analysis that art finds its fullest meaning and lasting relevance. As a foundation, we are particularly passionate about amplifying diverse artistic voices. We prioritize those from underrepresented backgrounds, create platforms for dialogue across cultures, and champion projects that explore identity, memory, and heritage. Art has always been a powerful force for social transformation, and we believe with all our hearts in its capacity to build more inclusive, empathetic communities. Our support takes many forms: grants, fellowships, scholarships, critical writing, exhibition, and the publication of new research to encourage experimentation and creative risk-taking. We are strong advocates for interdisciplinary collaborations and for blending the traditional with the contemporary. I'm happy to inform you that the process of compiling, sorting, and digitizing the Tyeb Mehta archives is complete. The archive includes interviews, photographs, paintings, and personal letters, among other things, and will shortly be available to scholars and researchers. We are already live and active on Instagram and Facebook, and we will be delighted to have you follow the foundation. Our website is also in the process of being designed, and we hope to have it live soon. Our future calendar of events includes more conversations, exhibitions, and the release of publications through the year. These will be announced through social media as well as through email. Those of you who wish to be informed can subscribe to our mailing list in the visitor's book that is kept outside. So I invite each of you, whether you are a student, an artist in search of inspiration, a scholar advancing critical thought, or an advocate who believes in the transformative power of art, to join us in ensuring Tyeb Mehta's visionary spirit continues to ignite imaginations, that diverse voices are heard and celebrated, and that art remains a vital force for understanding and connecting all of humanity. Today is a special occasion, one that holds deep personal significance for my father and for my family and me. As my mother Sakina Mehta mentioned earlier, we are honored to present 2 scholarships to deserving students at the prestigious JJ School of Art. This institution is not just a pillar of artistic excellence, but also a place that shaped my father's journey, a fact that makes this moment even more meaningful. It seemed only fitting that we begin this initiative here at JJ, where his passion for creativity was nurtured. Through these scholarships, we hope to support the next generation of artists as they pursue their dreams and contribute to the vibrant world of art. I would now like to invite my mother, Sakina Mehta, to present the awards. May I please ask the 2 awardees to join us on stage? Yeah, Sagnik Sen and Divyansh Singh. Yeah. Okay, the first scholarship goes to Sagnik Sen, a talented final year student pursuing a Bachelor of Arts at JJ School of Art. The second goes to Divyansh Singh. The second goes to Divyansh Singh, a remarkable student in the Master of Fine Arts program. And next, I'm delighted to request my mother, Sakina Mehta, to present to all of you the very first portfolio of prints showcasing the extraordinary works of Tyeb Mehta. And now, finally, I would like to introduce someone who, for this audience, needs no introduction. He is a renowned Indian poet, cultural theorist, translator, and curator. His notable poetry collections include Vanishing Act, Central Time, Jonawala, Hunch Prose, and Ice Light. He has translated works like I Lalla, the poems of Lal Der, a 14th century Kashmiri mystic, and The Homelands and Ocean, translations of Urdu poets Mir Taqi Mir. As a curator, Ranjit has organized India's first national pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2011 and co-curated the 7th Gwangju Biennale 2008. He has curated over 50 exhibitions, including retrospectives of artists like M.F. Hussain and F.N. Souza. He has received prestigious awards such as the Sahitya Academy Golden Jubilee Award, Sahitya Academy Translation Award, and the S.H. Raza Award for Literature. He has held fellowships and residencies worldwide and served on the Venice Biennale Jury 2015. A founding member of the Bergen Assembly's Advisory Board, he continues to influence global art and literature. May I invite Ranjit Hoskote to come on stage and deliver the Tyeb Mehta Annual Centenary Memorial Lecture 2025.
Could I have the slides on, please? Well, with such a magnificent audience, there's clearly no pressure at all on me. But I have to say that I am, like everybody else in this room, greatly overwhelmed by the significance of this occasion, for multiple reasons. Tyeb was one of those artists who meant a great deal to me, personally, in the way that I was able to think about post-colonial Indian art and, in some larger sense, about post-colonial history, if you will. I'm also struck by the fact that we are literally treading on hallowed ground here. In the first place, we're inside a building that was one of the very few buildings that was designed by an extraordinary architect, Durga Shankar Bajpai, who passed on far too early. We're also standing in the auditorium hall where, through the 1950s, not only did so many of these seminal artists show their works, but Ibrahim Al-Qazi also staged, I'm going to use that word advisedly, a series of what we would today call a constellation of exhibitions and lectures called This is Modern Art, which was his take on cultivating and, if you will, curating an audience for forms of visual art that were yet unfamiliar in these parts. And of course, in a completely memoiristic vein, it takes me back to my childhood, coming here with my parents, then as a teenager with Nancy, then beginning my career as a reviewer and a critic for the Times of India, and onward to the present. Thinking back to so many artists and exhibitions that I encountered here, M.F. Hussain, Akbar Padamsi, Tyeb himself, Jahangir Sabharwala, Vivan Sundaram, the list is endless, but also it came to me this morning that this is where I actually saw Wolfgang Leib's work for the first time. I think it pays to remind ourselves that Bombay is, in addition to being a South Asian metropolis, it's also a global cosmopolis. We have had currents come through from all parts of the world here, and they have nourished us. So I'm going to, well, those of you who've heard me lecture before and those who've suffered the even more dire fate of being my students will know that I usually begin with some kind of a roadmap. I'm not going to start with a roadmap today. Instead, I'm going to suggest that what I have to say is built around two questions that have long preoccupied me in the context of post-colonial Indian art. The first one has to do particularly with this first seminal generation of Indian artists. It has to do with what I think of as a shifting balance between a tendency towards modernizing, secularizing, if you will, and on the other hand, some attempt to return to and retrieve from the sacred. And I'm aware I'm skating out on thin ice here, but I'm doing that in a fairly advised kind of way. I'm very interested in the traces of the religious imagination, by which I don't really mean any allegiance to organized religion. I'm thinking rather of how, through artistic agency, a number of these artists were able to really go back to thinking of how to retrieve resources of hope, of heroism, of tragedy from whatever tradition or traditions they'd inherited. So this is pivotal to how I think about this generation of artists. A related and second inquiry has to do with, Yusuf, you talked about humanism, and I completely agree. Of course, there was a tremendous sense of empathy, of humanism. There was a heroism to that. But I'm also very intrigued by the possibilities that by devoting ourselves again to works like Tyeb's, what do they tell us about something that is not only abstract in a universal and humanist way, but in what way did an imagination like Tyeb's find itself nourished by questions and crises that were embedded very much in the regional? I don't want this to turn into a sort of inquiry into an ethno-historical perspective, nor am I trying to frame his work in the context of a religious tradition. But I would like us to think of what it means to be, across the long 20th century, what might it have meant to be somehow a religious artist, beyond strictures, dogmas, and doctrines. So those are the kinds of questions that I have in mind. I'm going to start by really taking us through images that are profoundly familiar to many of us, and yet when you look at them, you are seized again by the beauty and the power and the quality of disturbance that they carry. This is, of course, Trust Bull from 1956, many avatars of which were to then show up in Tyeb's work. Figure with rickshaw, Trust Bull on rickshaw, and the rickshaw puller from much, much later. And the diagonal. I'm going to dwell on all of these, but I want to start by thinking about what it was that took Tyeb away from the kind of maximalism. I keep saying Tyeb, by the way, because that is exactly how he insisted he should be referred to. When I wrote this monograph on him a number of years ago, in a formal vein, of course, I referred to him as Mehta, and he crossed that out everywhere, and he said, I'm not Mehta, Tyeb is how I wish to be known, so Tyeb it is. So, given that someone working in an environment like South Asia, which can hyperstimulate the imagination, given also that here was an artist from a generation that was tracing a wide arc around global art, what was it that prompted someone like Tyeb to not be a maximalist, but to pull back with restraint to a very quiet, if you will, set of focal or seminal images? That's one of the questions I want to think of here. Why is it that whether he was looking at the archive of Euro-American art or looking around at what was happening around him and what had been inherited, he chose this path that I sometimes think of as a yogic choice. Yogic in the sense that Roberto Calasso describes as the path of ardor. We too often think about yoga misleadingly as penance or austerity or self-mortification. I love the fact that a thinker like Calasso reminds us that yoga actually partakes of ardor. There is a powerful eroticism there. There's a powerful sensuousness. So when you look at works like these, what fascinates me at least is the way in which there is a certain yogic practice of focusing in Tyeb's work. It does not preclude the sensuous appreciation of a silken blue or the tremor of a line splicing two figures. Just going through images in preparation for this lecture, I found myself fascinated by a detail, the strange smudge around some of his straight lines. And I began to think, where did that emerge from? What does it tell us? Is that a brush that's sliding along the edge of a ruler? What is it that produces this peculiar little tremor? And these are the delights of viewing, I think. It's not only the grandeur of an idea or a proposition, it's also what makes your hair stand on end when you're in the presence of painting. Of course, the simpler solution to this question of yogic restraint is that Tyeb was also part of a generation that was caught up with embracing high modernism. And high modernism's great insistence was, of course, on the use of minimal means to yield maximal effects. I'm thinking here also of how much later in his career, and he lived in many places, London, Delhi, Shantiniketan, other than Bombay. I've been fascinated by how, for instance, with these drummer figures, you sense the dance, you sense the music, you sense the thrum of the choreography, and yet again, you're brought into the presence of something that is still. There's a stillness. And it's as if the vital powers of the imagination were being held in restraint. They were channelized into something that goes beyond the everyday project of survival. How did Tyeb come to choose these images? If we proceed by an archaeology of motive and decision, we may infer, and many of us know through the circulating anecdotes, that he began with images that had haunted him, burnt themselves deep into his mental circuitry. We know, for instance, that the early experience of the pre-partition riots here in the inner city branded themselves into his imagination. The experience of looking out of the window and seeing a man being beaten and stabbed to death, that remained with him forever. The horror of the abattoir, the trussing and killing of the bull, these were experiences that remained with him forever. But when you think about them, and I'll say a little more about this as we go along, there is both terror and there is a strange radiance. I'm struck by how, whilst this is a very personal vocabulary of obsessive images, it also shimmers out against a much wider social fabric. In the act of fashioning his mental images on paper and canvas, Tyeb translated emotive potential into palpable constructs. He created symbols through which he could bridge his own biography, his autobiography, with a universe of shared meaning. It's this that I want to explore here. What is it that helps the artist bridge his intuitions, his obsessions, his anxieties with much larger crises? And even if he does not set himself forth as a spokesperson for society, how, in fact, does he bear witness? In fact, the figure of the witness is crucial to a lot that I have to say today. And as we see, these are figures of crisis. Everything that I've just said in terms of the circumstances, the experiences that go into the making of these images indicates that they're figures of crisis. As I go along, I'll speak to the title of this talk, which is The Figure in Crisis, and that's a slightly different valency. Again, the Mahishasura, a powerful bringing together of goddess and demon, which is a sacred marriage, as well as an act of antagonism. Again, I flagged this here to talk about how throughout his life, in fact, one of his deep pursuits was that of bridging binaries, rejecting polarization. And of course, the falling figure on which I will dwell more as we go along. I want to briefly make an intermezzo here, dwelling on ways in which Tyeb's work has been read. Throughout the period in which he showed his work and received critical responses, reading back through, so to speak, the survey of the literature, I've always found myself uncomfortable by the ways in which critics from roughly the 50s all the way through the 90s, felt the need to approximate whatever was going on in Indian art to some imagined exemplar elsewhere, typically in the Euro-American world. And Francis Bacon was constantly trotted out as some kind of exemplar before Tyeb. And I want to, as an intermezzo before passing on to other things, I want to dwell on this a little, because what we're all involved with here is a participation not only in this direct encounter with images, but we also inherit forms of reading, sedimented modes of interpretation, which have the capacity to also distort how we look. So what you have before you is an amazing painting called The Play, in which I realize it's a relatively small image, but Tyeb pulls off something amazing. It's an image of two wrestlers grappling between lock and throw. It's readable as two aspects of a self in conflict, also a great motif with Tyeb. And they tackle one another through a glass bubble that doubles as a sign of circularity, and thus also of the unpredictable outcome of the match. It's sometimes been read as a quotation of Bacon, if I can get this to work. That figure is very much a quotation from one of Francis Bacon's paintings. It's not a simple quotation, is how I would argue the case. I think the painting very deliberately juxtaposes the fleshly, fluid-smeared Bacon figure with the stylized and even sublime Tyeb agonist. It's really, it stages a certain argument here. It's a proposition. I would go so far as to relate these two figures, the Baconesque and the Tyebian, to the Upanishadic twinned figure of the two birds, one acting and the other bearing witness, one bound to materiality by its actions, the other detached from the worldly cycles of action and reward, desire and frustration. And I think here of what David Sylvester wrote on Bacon in 1996. He described Bacon as an old-fashioned militant atheist who always seemed to be looking for pretexts to issue a reminder that God was dead, end of quote. Of course, Sylvester also points out that so many of Bacon's paintings suggest the religious painting, the altarpiece, the triptych. How does that hold alongside what I see to be Tyeb's project? The resemblance really ends there, because for Bacon, maverick lord of his godless universe, the figure is flesh, the figure is slimed with the leaky body's fluids, it's robust, it has a messy carnality. By contrast, Tyeb paints creatures of light who are marooned on earth. They're figures of a doomed heroism, struggling captives of destiny, angels thwarted in flight. I mean, there are multiple ways of reading that falling figure, but one of them is this. I suspect that Tyeb, through all of his anxieties, aspired to a sublime that transcended the polarity of beauty and terror, and that although he was in debate, in discourse, in his life choices, although he was very much a part of what you might want to call the secular world, I think he did not foreclose the option of the transcendent. For such an artist, Bacon could be a template, could be a point of departure, but he was not an exemplar to be emulated in a spirit of veneration. I think the most important dimension of the affinity is the fact that Tyeb's images are apocalyptic like Bacon's, but they accomplish their momentous quality by un-Baconesque strategies. There are two kinds of figures in Tyeb's iconography, and those of us who've looked at them over a period of time, you see them right there on that wall, which reminds us of so many of the peaks of his artistic oeuvre. One kind is born of terror and encompasses what might be called his victim types. The other is born of kindled hope and awe, and those are the ambiguous divine or demoniac figures. By a miracle of artifice, though, even Tyeb's oppressed figures can be radiant as the flash of an explosion, while his divine or demoniac figures can be anchored in a palpable materiality. I would like now to dwell on the falling figure. Now, this is taken from an early point in his career where you still see a certain experimentation with expressionist handling, with brushwork, with the fleshiness of the body. And then there's the much later fall. That falling figure was born from another struggle within the self. Because while Tyeb had decided to avoid an abjure narrative, he found that a certain accentuation of form could attenuate, reduce, diminish the forcefulness of the experience. The measure of free fall here, of course, and I continue with my emphasis on what it means to read an image through different lenses. One way of looking at the recurrence of the fall, free fall, or the headlong fall into the void in Tyeb's images relates one to an almost by default position of thinking about the biblical notion of the great lapse, the fall. We also hold in mind that this generation, Tyeb, Akbar, Hussein, Sousa, all of these and their contemporaries were all au courant with the literature that was emerging from post-war Europe. They were reading their Sartre, they were reading their Camus. So this notion of delirium and vertigo, of individuals who've come unfixed from their social location, from the milieu, of figures that are adrift in a world of sensations and provocations, figures of estrangement. I think one can draw a line between what they were reading, the debates that they were part of, and the images that emerged. So one way of reading this image could place it in a lineage with Icarus, for instance, or with Phaeton, figures of doomed ambition, the hero punished for an unwitting transgression or an unintended display of pride or recklessness. So that's one way of thinking about this, and I will make a certain seemingly idiosyncratic turn in terms of another way in which I think these images could be looked at. I would also like to dwell on the diagonal, that fierce weapon by which Tyeb reorganized space, once again staging the way in which a self could do battle with itself. We know again from anecdotal evidence that this was born almost fortuitously, out of painterly frustration. So much of this is received through oral history, a conversation between Tyeb and Hussein, a certain dissatisfaction expressed by one comrade to another, and Tyeb's slashing action across the canvas, which magically dynamized his picture space. I think whilst there is merit to this way of thinking about an improvised resolution to a seemingly intractable problem, how do you get your picture space to be animated? I would also think that there were much, much deeper reasons, compelling reasons, for why that diagonal took its place in Tyeb's oeuvre and what it really meant. I mean, I read it as a symbol of scission, of a simultaneous separation and twinning, which is necessary if you're going to come to terms and heal your own contradictions. I'm going to quote Gieve Patel, also a dear friend, also no longer with us, who took the emotional temperature of this key device of Tyeb's. He read it as indicating an artistic crisis which obliged Tyeb to choose between a centering approach to the figure, a reaction to fragmentation, and an approach that more accurately reflected the ambient condition of unsettling flux. I quote Gieve from an essay that appeared in Daedalus. He writes, "By the 1970s, the integrated figure no longer sufficed to embody Tyeb's intuition of the splintering of things around him. He allowed himself one stark implement. Just one. One stark implement, a diagonal of varying color, shape, and dimension, repeatedly cutting the single image into two. The obsessive quality of this device tells us how important it was to the painter. During those heroic 10 years, the 10 years in which the diagonal really presided over Tyeb's work, during those heroic 10 years, the splintered figure reached at itself across this dismembering lightning, using a variety of means to bridge the gulf and acquire wholeness, end of quote. As I read that passage, I remind myself also about how very important psychoanalysis, whether in the Freudian vein or the Jungian, was part and parcel of the reading of this generation. I find it intriguing to go back and think about what our predecessors were reading, what is it that they inherited from the flow of what was globally available. This slashing weapon demands to be contextualized, at least that's my view, in more historically specific ways. I've quoted Give on what I would see as a psychoanalytic way of looking at things. I would also like to see this archetypal sign of scission as emerging from other kinds of disquiets that, admittedly, I would speculate Tyeb was grappling with. And it seems to speak to a constant interplay in his art between an impulse towards survival, which meant there would be silence, there would be abstraction, clues would be buried, and on the other hand, there was the need to articulate, which led to this soundless but unmistakable voice of the figure. What really is this inexplicable diagonal, so often described by critics as a purely formal device or passed over solemnly as a psychological motif? It may certainly be read as an abstracted version of the sword of Kali. Significantly, Tyeb's icon of choice, whether Kali or Mahishasura Mardini, was invariably the Samhara Murti, the warlike deity embodying destruction, and not the Shantamurti, the benign deity in tranquility. Tyeb's quest had been for an imagery that could convey the extremity of conflict, of strife, of schism, without in the slightest way suggesting a literal explanation. And yet, when we stand in the presence of this diagonal, this sign of scission, of schism, it's very difficult to avoid thinking of a word and an experience that was critical to his generation, and the word I'm thinking of is partition. It's the partition of a space that was homogeneous until the making of this gesture. It marks the creation of two related but separate parts which are forever caught up between dialogue and antagonism. And so the diagonal leads directly to Tyeb's images of the 1980s and 90s, the man and the bull forming the conjoined halves of a tauromachy, Mahisha, who's part buffalo and part god. These are figures that will continue to haunt us in their doubleness, in their self-antagonism. At this point, I realize that many of the sources I'm quoting seem to point towards, if you will, epic or cosmic experience. But I can't help thinking, and even in the period when I was looking very, very closely at Tyeb's work, it struck me that the way in which his figures seem to move from one crisis to the next almost leaped out of the pages of the Indologist and mythologist Heinrich Zimmer's account of the Indic vision of crisis. Zimmer writes, like the human body, the cosmos is in part built up anew every night, every day. By a process of unending regeneration, it remains alive, but the manner of its growth is by abrupt occurrence, crises, surprising events, and even mortifying accidents. Everything is forever going wrong, and yet that is precisely the circumstance by which miraculous developments come to pass. End of quote. And Zimmer brings his general account to bear on the artistic consciousness in a manner that suited, I think, Tyeb's temperament and situation perfectly. This is what Zimmer writes. The catastrophe transforms the situation, forces an alteration of the creative spirit, and throws it into a play that carries it beyond itself. The planner, the watcher, is compelled to become the endurer, the sufferer. Such a metamorphosis into the opposite, into the absolutely alien, is what throws the knots that reticulate the net of the living whole and mesh the individual alive into the fabric. It's amazing how a phrase can leap out of a passage you read years ago and still be real, viscerally real to you, to me at least. When I think of that phrase, meshed alive into the fabric, it seems to speak to so many of the formal properties of Tyeb's figures, there's nothing really that divides the figure from the ground. The figure and the ground are absolutely imbricated in sections, and the tension and torsion pertains to them both. It's not a simple traditional figure versus ground binary. Having brought us to this point of thinking about larger cosmological questions, unending crises, I now want to make another proposal, which when it was originally made, I am of course working from long-held convictions that I've had about Tyeb's work. It seemed idiosyncratic and whimsical, but my proposal, provocative as it sounds when made in a public sphere that is torn between the twin intolerances of aggressive majoritarianism on the one hand and a dogmatic secularism, is this. I strongly have believed that the impetus that drives Tyeb's art is a tragic vision that's deeply rooted in his ethnic and religious background. And I've had a long time to think about this. As I said earlier, my attempt is not at all to somehow place the artist within a bubble of his birth circumstances. My preoccupation rather is to see how certain elements that come from the received and inherited background can be translated in quite startling ways. And can everybody see that? It's fairly detailed. In discussing Tyeb's affinity with Bacon, I've already alluded to Tyeb's wager on the transcendent. I would also go on to argue that Tyeb's art is not a secular practice. And I realize, of course, that the term secularism has become evacuated of meaning in these times, because it's come to mean whatever you want it to mean. I mean it in a fairly technical sense, where secularism means that one denies the sacred and transcendent and believes that everything can be done through reason. I'm far more interested in looking at those dimensions of Tyeb's art that are inspired and sustained, at least in my reading, at a deep subliminal level by the tragic Shia vision of history that he inherited from his background. What you see here comes from, what I've tried to do very, very briefly here is also to look at other points of reference which one doesn't normally think of when one thinks of Tyeb's work. The usual lineage and context comes from the large fabric of modernism. I'm wondering what it might mean to place his work in the context of this work, which comes from what's called the kehvakhane, or the coffee house genre of art, which was very popular in Qajar, Iran, through the last part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th. It, of course, refers to the pivotal occasion in the Shia worldview, which is the Battle of Karbala. Many of you here are familiar with it, but I would still go over the ground. The central figure in this story is, of course, Imam Hussein, who was the Prophet's grandson and the son of the Caliph Ali. The central topos of this story, and this is in fact a synoptic narrative, you can read it from left to right. It covers the events of the days of suffering and martyrdom, and you can see that the pictorial construction, the structure actually refers to the Marsiya. It's possible to actually recite the events using this painting as a pictorial narrative. Also, brief footnote, it is normally thought that there is no place for the painted image or the graphic image in the world of Islam. The world of Islam is far more complicated and complex than we think it is. And there's always been a tradition of the pictorial image, particularly in Iran and the Iranosphere. So as I was saying, and as many of you know, so I'm not telling you anything new, this is an event that took place in 680 CE. In the summer of that year, Imam Hussein declared that he would not submit to the dynastic and regal ambitions of the Umayyad tyrant Yazid, who had contravened the democratic spirit of early Islam. Leaving Arabia, Hussein crossed the desert of Iraq to Kufa, the oasis garrison where he had been promised support. On the plain of Karbala, Hussein and a small group of relatives, retainers, and loyal soldiers were ambushed by Yazid's troops. The Umayyads had intimidated his supporters. The Imam was left to his own devices. And on his refusal to submit himself to the tyrant, his camp was encircled, his people were starved and cut off from water, and the siege ends with the Umayyad forces slaughtering Hussein's group. The Imam himself was the last to die with his infant son in his arms. And there is a way in which, from the 17th to the early 20th century, this great and pivotal Shia narrative has really rippled out to become part of the story of many, many different forms of solidarity and uprising. And although Tyeb would always say that the Dawoodi Bohra community, his birth community, did not really practice the taziyeh, it's a recurrence. He would have seen this in Hussein, his contemporary M.F. Hussein's work. You see constantly Duldul and Zuljanah and the myth of Karbala. I can't help thinking when I look at a painting like this, or that, by the way, is it says Duldul. Duldul correctly is the white mule that belonged to the Prophet. This is Zuljanah, the Imam Hussein's gallant horse. Why I have this here is also to remind us of a different time in the story of this subcontinent, where Anant Shivaji Desai, who ran the Ravi Varma press after the master's passing, could produce images like this, admittedly out of commercial interest, but the fact is there would always have been a certain emotive and affective investment in producing images like this. At its most powerful mythic level, the story of Hussein's martyrdom is a story of the struggle for justice against oppression. Hussein is the innocent who is brought down by his enemies, the archetypal figure of and in crisis. In Tyeb's art, I would argue, we see the historical event already translated into myth in a collective framework being turned into a deeply personal and even intimate reality. I would go so far as to assert that many of Tyeb's recurrent images allude to secular, sometimes even subaltern avatars of Hussein, so that his art constitutes a way of approaching the ceremonial drama of the martyr in its everyday, almost routine forms. I'm trying to set up a loop between what it meant as a young man to look out of the window and see someone completely innocent being stabbed to death, and this larger myth that was inherited through retellings, through recitations, through images. And I have somewhat melodramatically described this elsewhere as the secret history of Tyeb's work, how he straddled the archetype and the ordinary experience. I'm going to conclude. How am I doing for time? Okay. I've proposed this contextual and politically fraught interpretation of what I see as the secret history of Tyeb's art quite deliberately. And there are 4 reasons for this interpretation. First, with complete respect, Yusuf, but I have to say that I've been troubled by the notion that there are, in fact, sovereign and universal values, which when you look closely at them, turn out to be either Eurocentric or anthropocentric in some way. And when we speak of a humanism or a universalism, when we look at art, of course there's the incredible core of empathy and of compassion, but might that sometimes lead us to opt for interpretations that take us away from these possibilities? I'd like to entertain the possibility that a variety of interpretations can be held in play. And of course, it's possible to look at these images, look at this context that I've suggested, and ask yourselves, are we pushing Tyeb back into some kind of tradition? And to that, I would say the following. There is really no such thing as tradition. Tradition is always an effort of retrieval. It's always a special form of modernity that recrafts the resources of the past. In the hands of revivalists, it's a menacing weapon of absolutism. But in the hands of artists, it can become a revitalizing and replenishing instrument. In this context, we shouldn't forget, we too often forget this, that even the arch modernists were people who came quite often from the ground of belief. We forget that Mondrian and Kandinsky were both believing theosophists, that Mark Tobey was a Baha'i. And what do we make of Picasso's iconography, which was steeped in archaic and antique Mediterranean culture, keyed to the bull ring at Pamplona and to the Minoan labyrinth? Or Chagall, who was a spirited nostalgist of Russian Jewish culture, or Matisse, who returned to the solar and water mythologies, or Bacon himself, who could never really get away from the portraits of the popes, for instance, or the great altarpieces. Secondly, I have to say that an argument like this might give us the sense that there is some ready-made collective memory or genetic memory that can be tapped. I don't think this is true. I think collective memory is a social construct that can be implemented selectively. And I quote Romala Thapar here. She puts it very eloquently, and I quote, "Collective memory need not be what is personally experienced, refined, or retained. It also draws on notions that we inherit from preceding generations and pass on to the next. The assumption here is that it is inherited, but it is equally likely that it is invented. Memory implies selection between what is to be remembered, what is to be forgotten, hence the significance of time and context. It also involves an audience that is linked to determining the form and content," which in another move makes me think of what is our responsibility as an audience to these images? What is our responsibility as an audience to the different kinds of readings that are offered for them? And I think that it's questions like these that take us away from being passive recipients or enthusiastic recipients, and also makes us critical, self-aware, and in the best sense, disoriented recipients of art. I also want to counter the belief, now far muted than before, but no less prevalent, that the art of this first generation of heroic post-colonial Indian painters was somehow too wrapped up in its transcendental concerns and its formal abstraction. I've myself been guilty of this reading. I would far rather think about how these artists, even whilst in their rhetoric they spoke of the autonomy of their art, were also working with philosophies they couldn't yet name, speaking from their histories, and trying to bridge those histories to forms of making that came from elsewhere. And while they soon grew in confidence and insisted on their own cultural position, the theoretical language that they employed remained what it had been when they were young people, hence notions of humanism, of autonomy. And this was something that Tyeb and I would actually talk about. And I remember those discussions also with Sakina and Nancy present, and those are some of the most cherished experiences of my life, because here was an artist who was not dogmatic. I would question him on what really he meant by the autonomy of the artwork, and he would then open himself up to what it could mean. And in fact, when I presented this argument to him, this precise tragic vision from sheer history argument, I was very, very struck by how he took that on board and did not immediately set it aside as being irrelevant. Of course, he did say to me, "Yaar mujhe Musalman mat banana." And that's when, also thanks to Nancy's diplomacy, we were able to argue for him that it was not an argument that pushed him into the ethos of his birth community. It was something else. It was how his imagination could really take on a mythos, take on mythic elements that could be true of him, but that could be true of other people too. Because really, everything that I've told you about Karbala stands true, but it isn't confined to a singular community. These motifs of justice, of tyranny, of suffering ripple out to embrace all of humankind. So in a way, we're thinking here of an inflected and informed humanism to which one could return through this detour. And this really, having said that, I had this to present the person of reason unconnected to these other affective and mythic capacities. But I'm going to conclude with two other images. This comes from a series of ink and wash drawings that Tyeb made while watching a production of The Trojan Women, in fact, by Akazi. And there's also an amazing body of work that Hussein has in relation to another production. Reminds us of the friendships and dialogues and exchanges that went on in that generation. But why do I have this here? For this reason. This, of course, is, on the face of it, an image that refers to a play by Euripides, referring to the end of the Trojan War, the destruction of Troy, and the capturing and enslavement of it, the killing of its men and the enslavement of its women. That could be Hecuba, it could be Andromache. But seen through this lens of the Shia tragic history, I look at that and think, that might be Zainab. It could be the sister of Imam Hussein, dwelling on the injustice meted out to the innocent. What does it mean to live under tyranny? What does it mean to resist it? And I think this is how, admittedly by this idiosyncratic but not completely whimsical argument of mine, I think this is how really images of artists from previous generations continue to resonate for us. Not because they've been embalmed in some interpretation, but because they renew themselves to us in our present experience. And I'm going to end with this image of the hand, which on the face of it might seem like a very simple drawing, but to me it speaks of resistance. And when I look at these two drawings, almost more than these resplendent paintings we've been looking at, it's these that hold, for me, the kernel of an old Shia saying, which some of you are probably familiar with. Kul yom ashura kul ard Karbala. Every day is the 10th of Muharram. Every place is Karbala. And I cannot think of anything that is more true of our present time, as exemplified by the barbaric horrors being unleashed by the state of Israel in Gaza. Thank you for your attention.
I enjoyed that very much. And although I must clarify what I said, is that when that happened, it was in the late 60s, before he actually started that whole journey. And yeah, so it was a journey for him. He moved on from that point and really did, I think. Also, I think when we speak of his Kali and Mahishasura paintings, we believe that it was caused by his Shantiniketan years and his visit to Calcutta, often forgetting that Calcutta was the home of his maternal grandparents, and he used to spend vacations there, and so he was very familiar with the images of Durga Puja, Kali, and must have gone to Kalibari, and you know, there are those whole Kali Ghat paintings. And yeah, so that is there. For me, some of his paintings always, when they speak of transformation rather than transcendence, and the transcendence is between both. I mean, Mahishasura is the god, and I mean the demon and the animal and the man, the animalistic spirit and the human spirit, and the struggle to be human is how I interpret a lot of those paintings. So anyway, finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out here in such large numbers and being such a wonderful audience. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I do. Thank you, and we'll see you again every year on the 26th of July. Thank you.